And welcome back. This is a presentation that's designed to help you understand how an argument can fail literally if you have too many fallacies in there, or if the information that you bring in from your outside sources contains a whole lot of fallacious information. And we first need to talk about what arguments are, and then we'll talk a little bit about fallacies so you can understand them. I plan to look at several fallacies in this presentation, so you're going to want to keep this presentation available to you. It's going to be in the Files section, so you go ahead and access it from there. So arguments. Most writing tasks in college that you're going to have ask you to make an argument. That is, present reasons for a particular claim or interpretation that you're putting out there. You might have been told that you need to make your arguments more logical, stronger, and you may have worried that you're simply not a logical person, or you wonder what that means, how to do that. Learning to make the best arguments you can is an ongoing process, but we're going to help you out with that today. So being logical is the key to this, and it's something anybody can do with enough practice. Each argument you make is composed of premises. This is a term for statements that express your reasons or evidence. So your conclusion is what we're going to call your thesis. So if you said something like, I believe that it's not good to kneel before a football game because we need to show respect for those who've gone to war, or whatever your reasons might be. That claim would be we shouldn't kneel, and anything after the word because are your premises, are your reasons leading to that. So you have to have logic involved there. You have to say that because of this and that, therefore I believe this. There has to be a logical statement. So we need to make sure that it doesn't have any fallacies in there. Excuse me. So using good premises, ones that you believe are both true and relevant to the issue at hand, are critical to a logical conclusion. Make sure your premises provide good support for your conclusion. Another way to say that is make sure your reasons for coming up with your position or your claim or your thesis are logical and not filled with false information. So you have to check that you've addressed the most important or relevant aspects of the issue. That is, your premises and conclusion focus on what's really important. What's an issue? An issue is basically what we're talking about. And the question is, what part of what we're talking about are we trying to answer? What question are we trying to give an answer to? And so you need to make sure that your argument itself answers the question. So by not making claims that are so strong or sweeping that you can't really support them, you should be able to come up with a logical conclusion or a position on the question that is defensible. You also need to be sure that you present all your ideas in the order that you give them initially. So that means when you give your argument statement in the beginning, I believe this because of reason 1 and reason 2 and reason 3, then your follow-on paragraphs where you discuss the support for the reasons should be in that same order, 1, 2, and 3. It helps your readers follow along, and it gives them some kind of a organized pattern that they can follow. So when I'm doing my arguments, when I'm coming up with my claim or my answer to the question, and I happen to want to give a good presentation, I want to really support it with good information that I pull from the sources, what if I create a fallacy? Well, that means your information is false, or it's actually not correct, and your readers are expecting you to go out and get the best information you possibly can, analyze it with your own critical thinking, and present it back to them. And if they see or sense that it's not really valid because it's full of fallacies, guess what? Your argument is no good, and you're going to lose your readers real quick. You might be wrong. You've used weak sense thinking. And what is weak sense thinking? That means we're trying to support our claim that we already pre-decided. We're trying to support something that we may or may not know is the right position to take. So here's the first of many fallacies that we're going to talk about. Hasty generalization. So that's when you make a decision or an assumption about a whole group or a range of cases based on a sample that's just not quite big enough, or what they call too small. So in this example, I say librarians are shy and smart, wealthy people are snobs, etc., etc. Those are common examples of the principle of underlying hasty generalization. I'll give you an example of that would mean something. If I went out and I asked 25 college students, do you prefer pizza or hamburgers? And I take their answer to be hamburgers generally, 75% of them said hamburgers, and I come back to you and I say, all college students prefer hamburgers, you know that I've made a leap of faith. And that leap of faith is not based on factual information, or at least not enough factual information. That's called a hasty generalization based on a small sample size. So if my roommate said her philosophy class was hard and the one I'm in is hard too, then we can say all philosophy classes are hard. Well, that's just not enough to give you that kind of a conclusion. So what you do is you have to ask yourself, what kind of a sample is this? Is it big enough? Is it valid enough? Is this people's opinions that I'm taking, or is it an actual factual data pile? Am I looking at stuff that's provable, factual information? So if it doesn't pan out, don't use it. Okay, here's another fallacy, missing the point, and this is a good one. The premises of an argument do support a particular conclusion, but not the conclusion that the arguer actually draws. So that's where you say something like, the seriousness of a punishment should match the seriousness of the crime. Right now, the punishment for drunk driving may simply be a fine, but drunk driving is a very serious crime that can kill innocent people. So you should give people that are convicted of drunk driving the death penalty. Really? Okay. So the argument actually supports several conclusions. Punishment for drunk driving should be very serious in particular, but it doesn't support the claim that the death penalty is warranted, does it? No. So separate your premises from your conclusion. Look at the premises. Ask yourself what conclusion an objective person would reach after reading them. In the previous example, take a look at, drunk driving is a serious crime. It can kill innocent people. So what kind of logical conclusion can we come up with that for the punishment? Death penalty? Probably not. Serious incarceration? Possibly. Huge fines? Maybe. Take away your license for a hell of a long period of time? More than likely. So separate the premises from the conclusion and see, does it make sense? Does it ring true? False cause, or post hoc fallacy. This comes from the Latin phrase post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after this, therefore because of this. So it's just a whole big fancy way of saying because B comes after A caused B. Because B comes after A caused B. Now that may not be true, right? So sometimes one event really does cause another, but most of the time it doesn't always. So we can't always make that example. So if I said to you, this person went into an ice cream shop, ate some ice cream, came out and shot somebody dead. We can't then say eating ice cream can make you a homicidal killer. We can't say that, because even though B happened after A didn't necessarily cause B. So to avoid the post hoc fallacy, the arguer needs to give us some explanation of the process by which the conclusion is made. So if President Jones raised taxes and the rate of violent crime went up, Jones is responsible for the rate of violent crime rising. That's just not true. So to avoid it, some explanation of the process by which the tax increase is supposed to produce higher crime rates has to be proven. And if you can't prove that because of the higher crime rates, higher taxes, crime rates went up, then A does not necessarily cause B. You have a false cause fallacy. So make sure that when you try to say A caused B, you need to tell us how that happened or why that happened, or at least tell yourself. Slippery slope, this is my favorite one. This is the one that you'll see a lot in politics. And what this really is try to imagine you're walking along a stream or a riverbank, and it's kind of sloped down to the water, and it's pretty muddy. And you're just standing there looking down at the water, and you know that if you take one step, you might start slipping, and there won't be any way to stop that slip because you're on a slope, and right down into the water you're going to go. So the real definition of a slippery slope is that a chain reaction has to come when you take the first step. It will happen. And so the arguer is going to assert that if you take one step onto the slippery slope, you're going to wind up in the water. That's what we're talking about. So here's an example. Animal experimentation reduces our respect for life. If we don't respect life, we're likely to be more and more tolerant of violence. Soon our society will become a battlefield in which everyone constantly fears for their lives. It will be the end of civilization. So to keep that from happening, don't allow animal experimentation right now. Well, it may be true, it may not be true. But what you're saying is you're asking people to believe that if you allow animal experimentation, we're going to have the end of mankind. We're going to find humanity being decimated because of this violent nature that we've created by allowing animal experimentation. So it may or may not happen, but this fallacy, the slippery slope, says that it's going to happen no matter what. Once you take that first step, you won't be able to stop the set of events that come after that. Okay, a weak analogy. Well, we know what an analogy is. One thing is like another. Two or more things are similar enough. And so in a weak analogy, what you might say is that because these two items are similar, if something happens to item one, then it's going to happen to item two. Well, you have to take a look at how similar and why they're similar. And then you take those similarities and apply them to the actual event. You say, what caused that event to happen? Is that causal factor in both of those items that you're trying to do an analogy for? And if it's not, then you just can't give that strong of an analogy with that. So here's the example. Guns are like hammers. They're both tools. They have metal parts. They could be used to kill someone, yet it would be ridiculous to restrict the purchase of hammers. So restrictions on purchasing guns are equally ridiculous. Well, it sounds like the NRA there, doesn't it? So while guns and hammers do share certain features, these features like metal parts, being tools, potentially violent, are not the ones at stake in deciding whether to restrict them. Rather, we restrict guns because they can easily be used to kill large numbers of people at a distance. You can't do that with a hammer unless you're really good at throwing them, I guess. This is a feature hammers don't share. It would be hard to kill a crowd with a hammer, thus the analogy is weak, and so is the argument that you're basing on it. If you think about it, you can make an analogy of some kind between almost any two things in the world. My paper's like a mud puddle because they both get bigger when it rains. I work more when I'm stuck inside. And they both get kind of murky. So the mere fact that you can draw an analogy between two things doesn't prove much at all. And I'm going to apologize for reading a lot of these things word for word, but I want you to see it and hear it. I want you to get it in through a couple of different senses because it's important that you remember the key factors of each of these analogies or each of these fallacies, because these fallacies are going to be important to you as you go along, not just for your writing, but there's going to be a quiz at some point. So just keep that in mind. So arguments by analogy are often used in discussing abortion. So people frequently compare a fetus with an adult human being, then they argue that the treatment would violate the rights of an adult human being. Also, that violates the rights of a fetus. So whether that's true or not, it needs a lot more discussion. It needs a lot more analysis and a lot more data. So if the property that matters is having a human genetic code or the potential for life to be able to draw an analogy, then it could work. Adult humans and fetuses do share that property. So the argument and the analogy are strong. But if the property itself of being self-aware, rational, able to make your own decisions, able to survive on your own, then adult humans and fetuses don't share it, and the analogy is weak. By the way, I'm not making any comments about whether abortion is a good thing or not. I absolutely will never talk politics in this class. So the tip on this is identify what properties are important and to the claim and what you're trying to prove by using the comparison. And if it does work, use it. If it doesn't work, you've got a weak analogy, do not use it. Okay. Appeal to authority. So anybody out there know who, let's see. Well, we've got a lot of Dr. Oz is a good one. Dr. Oz is the guy on TV who sells a lot of products. He does a lot of analysis of different things. Dr. Oz happens to be a very well-respected cardiac surgeon from Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York. But Dr. Oz has a show and he pitches things like how to keep your hair from falling out, how to lose weight, how to keep your skin from having pimples, and all those kind of things. And just because he's named Dr. Oz, just because his title is doctor, people tend to say, yeah, boy, he knows about that kind of stuff. He's a doctor. Well, does he? Does he really? He knows a lot about cardiac surgery, but what does he know about hair falling out? What does he know about pimples? What does he know about weight loss? He may know a lot, but his credentials don't necessarily indicate that. They don't necessarily give him the ethos to carry that kind of a statement. And so this appeal to authority in this case is weak, very weak. If he were talking about cardiac surgery and we used him for that, yeah, he's strong. He's the guy. But talking about losing your hair, I don't know. He's got a good head of hair. I don't think he's the guy. Okay, so if we take this example, we should abolish the death penalty. Many respected people, such as actor Guy Hansen, have publicly stated their opposition to it. So while Guy Hansen may be an authority on matters having to do with acting, there's no reason anyone should be moved by his political opinions. He's probably no more of an authority on the death penalty than the person writing the paper. What's the most recent example of this kind of appeal to authority that you can think of? I will tell you, for me, it's the political support that we're getting from this actor or that actor. We've got Quentin Tarantino supporting Donald Trump. We've got a whole bunch of people on the other side supporting the Democrats, and they all say you should never vote for that other guy because I'm telling you what it means to me. Well, so what? So what? You're an actor. What does that have to do with politics? Do you have any credentials that make you an authority that I should listen to? So just be careful when you're using authority. Make sure that authority has the credentials to carry the statement. So there's an easy way to avoid committing this appeal to authority. First, make sure that the authorities are experts. And second, rather than just saying this expert believes X, we should also believe it too. Try to say what the reasoning is. Why does that person say that? And use the logic of their argument rather than the title behind their name. Ad populum, that means to the people. That's another Latin phrase. To the people. There are several versions of this, but all of them have the arguer taking advantage of the desire of most people to have to be liked or fit in or whatever. They want to be like everybody else, or they want to not be an oddball or the odd person out. One of the most common versions of this is in which the arguer tries to convince the audience to do or believe something because everyone else supposedly does. Example, gay marriages are just immoral. 70% of Americans think so. While the opinion of most Americans might be relevant in determining what laws we should have, it sure doesn't determine what is moral or immoral. So just because a lot of people say it doesn't mean it's what you should present. The example that I have of that is when I was a kid, cigarette smoking was not as bad as it is today. I mean, everybody smoked, and it was all over television, and they had ads all over magazines and billboards and everything. And one of the series of ads that most impresses me even to this day is that on the back of magazines, they had this full cover ad that said 7 out of 10 doctors prefer Camel cigarettes for their patients, or 7 out of 10 doctors prefer the taste of, or prefer the smoothness of. And they're saying these doctors are inferring that they're recommending Camel cigarettes, which was at that time one of the worst. No filter. You're smoking tobacco right into your lungs, and no smoke is good, but these were really bad. And what we found out was that what they did was called up these doctors and said, "Do you smoke?" And if they said no, they immediately crossed them off. So they kept going until they got doctors who actually did smoke, and they said, "Okay, which cigarette do you prefer for the following? Smoothness, taste, whatever." And 7 out of the 10 that they got might have said Camel, or they might have even asked them a more convoluted question. If I asked you if you like Camel, what would you say? Yeah, sure. And so what you have is a lot of twisting of facts, twisting of data. So you're going to learn something about methodology at some point in the future, but back then these ads were based on fiction, based on baloney, based on false methodology. And so to come up with 7 out of 10 doctors prefer or recommend and put that on the back of a magazine, that's as fallacious as it gets. So make sure you're not recommending that your readers believe your conclusion just because everybody else believes it. All the cool people believe it. All the cool people believe it. People will like you better if you believe it, and so forth. Just keep in mind, popular opinion is not always right. And I can prove that. Popular opinion had us going with Donald Trump. Popular opinion now has us going with Joe Biden. Popular opinion had us going with, ridiculous choices. And I'm not saying either of those were ridiculous, but what I'm saying is one week they're in popular, and the next week they're unpopular. So popular choice is not the best way to go. We call that going along with the crowd. Going along with the crowd. And by the way, that's the anti-critical thinking, going along with what everybody else thinks. That's system one thinking at its worst. Ad hominem is to the person. Hominem is the person. So ad hominem, it focuses attention on people rather than on arguments. So you shouldn't believe so-and-so's argument is what this is all about. The reason for not believing so-and-so is that he's a bad person or she's a bad person, and that's an ad hominem, or a hypocrite, and that would be an ad hominem tu quoque. Tu quoque is a way of saying you do it too. So in an ad hominem argument, the arguer attacks his or her opponent instead of the argument. So what? You don't like the person. It doesn't mean they're not logical or right or giving you right information. Andrea Dworkin has written several books arguing that pornography harms women, but Dworkin is just ugly and bitter. So why should we listen to her? Dworkin's appearance and character have nothing to do with the strength of her argument. Nothing to do with the strength of her argument. So using them as an ad hominem slam against her to get us to not listen to her is the fallacy. So in a tu quoque, the argument points out that the opponent has actually done the thing he or she is arguing against, and so the opponent's argument shouldn't be listened to. And you see that all the time in politics too. You see Joe Biden getting up and talking about we shouldn't ever do this and we shouldn't ever do that, and then they bring up a film from 20 years ago where he says we should do this and we should do that, advocating the things he's now advocating against. People change their minds all the time. So there is a lot of hypocrite arguments out there. So here's an example. Imagine your parents have explained to you why you shouldn't smoke, and they've given you a lot of good reasons. It's bad for your health. It costs a lot of money. You'll smell. You'll burn your hole in your clothes and all that. And then you turn to them and you say, I won't take that argument because you used to smoke when you were my age. You did it too. That's a tu quoque. They're right. It's bad for you. It costs you money. It's bad for your health. Just because they did it doesn't make it good for you. It's bad for you. And so just because they did it doesn't mean they're not right in telling you not to do it. So be sure to stay focused on your opponent's reasoning rather than their personal character. The exception, of course, is when you're making an argument about somebody's character. If your conclusion is this is an untrustworthy person, then you have to talk about their character. Appeal to sympathy. Appeal to sympathy is, imagine the video running of the shaking, vibrating, sad-looking, dirty, probably smelly puppies out in the cold, and Sarah McLachlan singing a sad song in the background. And what they're trying to do is to get you to send them money to their cause so that they can theoretically save these puppies. Well, you need to know that only 22% of the money that they're raising actually goes to saving the puppies. Everything else goes to what they call administrative costs. So this appeal to sympathy is when you try to get people to accept a conclusion by making them feel sorry for someone or something. So I know the exam's graded based on performance, but you should give me an A. My cat's been sick, my car broke down, I've had a cold. Man, you can't imagine how many people I have had with people in their family with COVID, and I'm sure most of it's true. And when you hear these things, your heart goes out to them. It really does. But the problem is we teachers have had a long history of people saying, my computer broke, or my modem doesn't work anymore, or my Wi-Fi went down, or all those things. And you get to the point where you say, you know, I'm starting to become a little cold to this. I'm starting to like, yeah, okay, really? And that's, I know, not fair, but it happens all the time. It happens in real life too. So when you have these appeals to sympathy, just know that the person you're trying to give it to, trying to sell it to, is already probably starting with a little bit of, oh yeah, sure. And when they do that, that makes your argument a little bit weaker. Whether or not you're telling 100% truth is not the question. It's how they usually receive that kind of information. So, you know, and by the way, any of you have had any experience with COVID, I am very sorry for you. It's evidently a very, very horrible thing. So I hope none of you ever get it, or anybody you know never gets it. So make sure you're not simply trying to get your audience to agree with you by making them feel sorry for you or someone else. Okay, appeal to ignorance. In the appeal to ignorance, the arguer basically says, look, there's no conclusive evidence on the issue at hand, therefore you should accept what I'm telling you. You can't prove me wrong, so you might as well believe me. So people have been trying for centuries to prove that God exists, right? And so no one yet has been able to prove God exists. I mean, you might totally believe, there might be 100% faith, but there's no proof. Therefore, God does not exist. What? Really? Well, that's an appeal to ignorance. So here's an opposing argument that commits the same fallacy. People have been trying for years to prove that God does not exist, but no one has yet been able to prove it. Therefore, God does exist. Well, in each case, the arguer tries to use the lack of evidence as their argument. So we don't have any evidence, you can't prove me wrong, so you got to go along with me. And that just doesn't work, folks. It doesn't work. So look closely at arguments where you point out a lack of evidence and then draw a conclusion from that lack of evidence. That's no. Straw man. Well, I'll tell you something else about straw man in a minute about the Second Amendment. But straw man is when you make your argument stronger, what you do is you set up a weak version of the opponent's position and try to score points by knocking that weak person down, that weak image of that person. So you don't have to knock down the whole person, because it might be a very powerful person, but make up a little tiny bit of that person and then knock it down. You effectively have done the same thing. So it isn't very impressive to do that. You're defeating a watered down version of your opponent's argument, and that's not very impressive either. Here's an example. If feminists want to ban all pornography and punish everybody who looks at it, but such harsh measures are surely inappropriate, so the feminists are wrong. Porn and its fans should be left in peace. the feminist argument is made weak by being overstated. Okay? Feminists want to ban all pornography and punish everyone who looks at it. Is that necessarily true? Is that what they all want to do? Most feminists do not propose an outright ban on porn or any punishment for those who merely view it or approve of it. Often they propose some restrictions on particular things like child porn, of course, or propose to allow people who aren't hurt by porn to sue publishers and who are hurt by porn to sue publishers and producers and not viewers for damages. So the arguer hasn't really scored any points, committed a fallacy, a straw man fallacy. Feminists want to do the following. That's just, you're trying to say that this is the sum total of feminists, and it's just not right. So be charitable to your opponents. State their arguments as strongly and accurately and sympathetically as possible, and if you can knock down even the best version of their argument, you have become the winner. So this is really important when we talk about counter arguments, by the way. You don't start off a counter argument by saying how dumb that person could be for thinking that. What you do is you say, here's why they think it, and they have evidence, and they have good logic behind it. And then you either refute it by saying, but here's why it's not good, or you concede to it. You say, yes, that's a true argument. That's a true logic that they've come up with, but our logic is a little bit stronger than theirs. So straw man doesn't really win anything. All it does is it makes you look like a weak arguer. It makes you look like you're just going after something that you've decided is the sum total of your opponent. Red herring. Okay, let's talk. Oh, by the way, I want to go back and talk about the straw man. So the straw man, there's a phrase in the Second Amendment kind of situations when you go out, like in the state of California, or all over the country actually, to buy a weapon, to buy a gun. There's one of the questions is this a straw man purchase? Which means, are you buying it in your name, but it's really for somebody else? So are you being a false image of the person that's actually buying that? So just wanted to bring that up. You may hear that. I didn't want you to be confused by that at all. Okay, red herring. Red herring is when it's called a fallacy of distraction. And it's when the arguer goes off on a tangent, raising a side issue that distracts the audience from the question at hand. Often the arguer never returns to the original issue. So an example, grading this exam on a curve would be the most fair thing to do. After all, classes go more smoothly when the students and the professor are getting along well. So let's try our premise, conclusion, outlining to see what's wrong with this argument here. So if you want this class to go smoothly and everybody get along, you should grade on a curve, right? Well, no, not really. So when we lay it out this way, classes go more smoothly when the students and the professor are getting along well. So the conclusion is grading this exam on a curve would be the most fair thing to do. It's obvious that the arguer went off on a tangent. The fact that something helps people get along doesn't necessarily make it more fair, doesn't make it a better class, doesn't make you learn any better. It's all about making it easier. So try laying out your premises and conclusions in an outline kind of form. How many issues do you see being raised in your argument? Can you explain each premise and support the conclusion? That way you don't have a red herring. Red herrings, by the way, are very super popular in presidential elections. You heard a lot of, if you did have any time to listen to any of the debates before the elections, what you hear are people asking a question of a candidate, and the moderator says, here's my question, and the candidate says, well, yeah, but I want to talk about something else. Or maybe they even sneaky, they say, yeah, that's a good thing, and then they immediately talk about something else without even saying they're going to do that. And so what they're doing is they're changing the subject. They're trying to distract all the focus off of the question that they know they don't have a good answer for and onto something that paints them in a better light. And so here's why they call it a red herring, and probably nobody's ever told you this. Back in the early days of our country, the British had this sport called foxing, and they would hunt foxes. And what they would do is they would get on their big white horses with their red coats and their big black caps, and their whips, and they would have these dogs, beagles usually, because they made a lot of noise. And they would set a fox loose. And then these beagles, who are incredible at smelling things, would go running after the fox and try to find it by sniffing on the ground. And when they followed the scent of the fox, they would get to a tree where the fox, by the way, they can climb like a cat. The fox had gone up to the top of the tree, and the dogs know they're up at the top because of the scent. They would sit at the bottom of that tree and start howling like crazy. And the hunters would go trotting along, and they'd get up to the bottom of the tree, pull out their rifles, and shoot the fox. So a lot of people didn't want that to happen. They thought that wasn't a fair way to hunt. And so what they did was, at night before the fox hunt, they would go to the fish market and take a lot of the rotten old fish carcasses and spread them on the ground around the hunt site. And that way the dogs couldn't get past the smell of fish to follow the fox. The fox would get away and be happy for the rest of its little fox life. So this distraction of the fish got known as the red herring, because a herring is a fish, and a red herring was probably the kind of fish that they used in this sport of distraction. Just thought I'd let you know that. Okay, that's the end of this presentation. Then go to the next, by the way, keep this presentation and study it, and go to the next assignment where you'll be reading from the workbook. Thanks.